The first test was supposed to be harmless. A reinforced observation chamber, pressure rated far beyond anything Vought had ever built before, sealed shut as Saitama stepped inside and waited patiently. Technicians watched heart rate monitors flatline into uselessness, instruments recalibrate themselves, and baseline readings return values marked invalid instead of numbers. Then the floor cracked. Not from an attack, not from strain, just from Saitama shifting his weight because his feet were tired. Stress alarms screamed as the chamber compensated, walls flexing in ways concrete was never meant to. Scientists froze, fingers hovering over abort switches that suddenly felt meaningless. "Tell him to stop moving," someone whispered. No one did. Saitama scratched his head, apologized casually, and asked if he was standing in the wrong place. At that moment, the containment wing lost power. 3 servers corrupted themselves trying to log the data, and Vought realized they hadn't built a test. They had built a countdown. And as executives ordered the experiment to continue, none of them noticed the more dangerous truth forming quietly behind the glass. This wasn't a study anymore. It was the beginning of something Vought would not survive. You're watching the moment curiosity turns into catastrophe. What Vought does next won't stay contained, and missing it means missing the escalation that breaks everything they touch. Subscribe once, because once the testing continues, there's no rewind, only consequences. Vought did not approach Saitama with fear. That would have required imagination. They approached him with contracts, non-disclosure agreements, and a presentation deck that framed the entire meeting as an opportunity. A chance to better understand anomalous physiology. A chance to advance safety. A chance to explore mutually beneficial cooperation. Saitama listened politely while eating fries from a paper bag. He nodded at the right moments. He asked one question, whether lunch would be provided if the tests ran long. When Ashley Barrett assured him it would, he shrugged and agreed. There was no negotiation, no suspicion, no sense that anything significant was happening. To Vought, that was reassuring. They classified him as compliant/low-ego/non-adversarial within the hour. The first facility was subterranean, miles of reinforced concrete and vibration-dampening architecture built originally to test next-generation SUPs. Saitama walked in under escort, hands in pockets, eyes drifting over warning signage he didn't read. Scientists whispered behind observation glass, excited but controlled. "This is just baseline," the lead analyst said. "We establish reference points, then scale." Saitama stepped onto the platform as instructed. The floor sensors registered nothing. Technicians frowned and recalibrated. The system pinged again, then again, each time returning error codes instead of values. Heart rate monitors failed to sync. Thermal readings spiked, dropped, and then flatlined into uselessness. "He's interfering with the instruments," someone muttered. "No," another replied. "He's not doing anything." That answer spread uneasily through the room. Saitama stood still while they ran scans. He yawned once. When asked to lift a standardized weight, a massive steel cylinder designed to test upper limits, he picked it up, paused, then set it back down carefully because the grip felt slippery. The load sensors overloaded instantly. Not from the lift, from the placement. Engineers scrambled to stabilize the platform as microfractures spiderwebbed outward, alarms blaring at thresholds that shouldn't have been reachable. Saitama stepped back quickly, concerned. "Sorry," he said, "was that too heavy?" No one answered. The test was marked inconclusive. The second phase began anyway. Vought escalated carefully, swapping equipment, adjusting parameters, reframing expectations. They introduced kinetic resistance fields, neural response tests, metabolic stressors. Each failed in a different way. Some returned impossible values. Others simply shut down, their internal logic loops unable to reconcile the data. Saitama remained unfazed. When asked if he felt any discomfort, he said no. When asked if he felt strain, he said maybe boredom. When told to stop moving between tests, he apologized and tried harder to stand still. That's when the wall cracked. Not explosively, quietly. A low, resonant sound as reinforced concrete flexed under stress it was never meant to experience. Structural integrity alarms flared red across the room. Engineers shouted to halt the session. Saitama shifted his weight again, instinctively stepping away from the damaged area. The crack widened. Containment doors slammed shut automatically. Power rerouted. Emergency protocols triggered without authorization. Somewhere deep in the facility, a server rack fried itself attempting to log the anomaly. Ashley Barrett arrived mid-chaos, heels clicking sharply against the floor as she surveyed the scene. "Why is this happening?" she demanded. A senior scientist swallowed. "We don't know how to measure him." Ashley's jaw tightened. "That's not an answer. It's the only honest one we have." That word, honest, was quietly removed from the official incident report. The session ended with polite apologies and assurances that everything was under control. Saitama was escorted out with a boxed lunch and a voucher for future participation. He waved, thanked everyone for their time, and left without a second thought. Behind him, the facility entered partial lockdown. Vought's internal response was swift and sanitized. Publicly, nothing happened. Privately, departments stopped sharing data. Executives demanded clearer metrics. Scientists argued behind closed doors, some insisting the instruments were faulty, others quietly questioning whether the premise itself was flawed. "He violates conservation laws," one analyst whispered. "Everything violates something at first," another replied. "We just haven't found the right framework." That belief that there must be a framework kept the tests alive. The boys learned about the situation through a low-level leak that didn't make sense at first. Huey stared at the report, confused. "They're studying him," he said, "like a lab rat." Butcher snorted. "Vought studies everything. Question is what breaks first." They watched surveillance footage of Saitama entering the facility, calm and cooperative, and felt a rare, uncomfortable sensation. Pity, because Saitama wasn't being exploited. Not yet. He was being underestimated. Back at the facility, repairs were already underway. Stronger materials were requisitioned. Budgets expanded. Test parameters quietly loosened. Vought didn't see a threat. They saw a challenge. And challenges were meant to be solved. As night fell, a junior scientist stared at corrupted data logs scrolling endlessly across her screen, numbers that refused to settle, equations that ate themselves. She closed the file, hands shaking slightly. "This isn't research," she whispered to no one. "It's escalation." The next test was scheduled for the morning. And this time, Vought wasn't interested in baseline anymore. They wanted answers, no matter what the systems had to sacrifice to get them. Vought didn't call it a failure. They called it a calibration issue. Overnight, the first facility was scrubbed, repaired, and reclassified. Incident reports were rewritten to remove language like structural anomaly and unbounded variance. In its place came safer terms: unexpected load distribution, instrument drift, environmental interference. By sunrise, the narrative was clean. The response was escalation. A second site was activated outside the city, larger and deeper, designed for classified weapons development rather than soup testing. This time, Vought didn't invite Saitama casually. They framed it as a continuation and efficiency measure. Fewer trips, better equipment, same harmless cooperation. Saitama agreed because it sounded convenient. He arrived wearing the same clothes, carrying a plastic bag with discounted groceries inside. Security scans failed again, forcing guards to wave him through manually. He smiled apologetically, as if he were the inconvenience. Inside the observation room, the mood had changed. The scientists were still professional, but the excitement was gone. What replaced it was intensity, tight voices, clipped sentences, eyes flicking between screens too often. They weren't curious anymore. They were invested. "This time we control the variables," the lead researcher said, more to herself than to anyone else. "No free movement, no adaptive testing. We constrain inputs." Saitama nodded, "Okay." They started with endurance metrics. Not strength, not output, just time. Saitama stood on a platform inside a sealed chamber while environmental conditions shifted around him. Heat rose first, then dropped sharply. Pressure increased. Oxygen levels dipped. Radiation filters cycled on and off. Saitama waited. Minutes passed, then an hour. His vitals didn't change. Sensors recalibrated automatically, assuming malfunction. They recalibrated again. The system flagged itself for diagnostics, then returned to standby mode without explanation. "He's not adapting," a technician said quietly. "He's static." "That's impossible," another replied. "Everything adapts." Saitama raised a hand. "Am I supposed to do something?" "No," the lead researcher said quickly. "Just stay there." He did. After 3 hours, the test was terminated, not because Saitama failed, but because the systems could no longer justify running. The environmental processors were overheating from continuous correction loops, trying to induce variance where none existed. Saitama stepped out, stretched his arms, and asked if the cafeteria was still open. The next phase involved force interaction. This wasn't lifting weights anymore. It was controlled opposition. Robotic frames designed to apply calibrated resistance, each one capable of matching an escalating force based on feedback. The first unit engaged Saitama's wrist. It lasted 0.4 seconds before its actuators locked permanently. Internal motors fused from feedback they weren't rated to receive. Saitama blinked, surprised. "Oh, did I break it?" "No," a scientist said automatically. "It exceeded tolerance." They deployed a second unit. Then a third. Each one failed differently. One seized up. One shut down preemptively. One simply powered off as if refusing the task. The logs made no sense. Force values spiked, inverted, then returned null. Ashley Barrett observed from behind the glass, arms crossed. "Why does it look like the machines are quitting?" No one answered her. Behind the scenes, internal communications grew frantic. Engineers argued over whether the hardware was flawed or whether the testing model itself was invalid. Analysts tried to overlay compound V metrics onto the data and found no correlation. Nothing mapped, nothing scaled. This wasn't high power. It was unquantifiable power. That realization terrified the scientists. It infuriated leadership. "Run neurological scans," an executive ordered over comms. "There has to be a source, a trigger, something we can isolate." Saitama sat patiently as electrodes were placed on his head. He asked if this was like a sleep study. When no one laughed, he stopped asking questions. The scans returned blank. Not noisy, not distorted. Blank. The system couldn't establish a baseline neural pattern to read against. Every attempt to stimulate a response returned the same result: flat, consistent, uninterested. One junior analyst whispered, "It's like the system can't tell he's there." That comment was removed from the transcript. Hours into the session, something changed, not with Saitama but with the observers. A senior physicist excused himself and didn't come back. Another requested reassignment. A third stared at the live feed, hands trembling slightly, then shut his terminal down without explanation. Saitama noticed the tension. "Am I causing trouble?" he asked. Ashley Barrett forced a smile. "No, you're doing great." That lie sat poorly in the room. The final test of the day was unauthorized. A small team rerouted power from a neighboring sector and activated a kinetic suppression field meant to neutralize enhanced individuals. It had never been used on anyone before. Officially, it didn't exist. Saitama felt a slight pressure, like standing in a stiff breeze. "That tickles," he said. The field collapsed instantly. Not explosively. It just stopped. The generators didn't fail. They disengaged as if the system had decided the configuration was invalid and returned to default. Red lights flashed. Ashley's comm buzzed with half a dozen overlapping alerts. "Who approved that test?" she snapped. No one answered. Security moved in, not toward Saitama, but toward the control room. Someone was crying quietly near a console, whispering, "We can't model this. We can't contain this. We don't even know what question to ask." Saitama stood up. "If this isn't working, I can come back another time." That suggestion made things worse. "No," Ashley said too quickly. "We're just adjusting." Adjusting meant pushing further. Because Vought didn't know how to stop. By the end of the day, the facility had lost 2 containment chambers, 4 server clusters, and the confidence of its senior scientific staff. Officially, the results were classified as promising but incomplete. Privately, a memo circulated with a single line highlighted in red. "Subject does not fit any existing or projected power curve." The boys intercepted that memo late that night. Butcher read it twice, then set the tablet down slowly. "They're not learning," he said. "They're digging." Huey swallowed. "What happens when they hit bottom?" Butcher didn't answer. Back at his apartment, Saitama unpacked his groceries and cooked dinner, unaware that an entire corporate empire had begun reorganizing itself around his existence. He ate quietly, turned on the TV, and fell asleep halfway through a rerun. Miles away, in a sealed executive room, Vought approved Phase 3. They stopped trying to measure Saitama. They started trying to provoke him. And that was when things became dangerous. Phase 3 was never written down in full. It existed in fragments, emails forwarded without headers, meeting notes that skipped conclusions, directives phrased as suggestions that no one felt safe refusing. Vought stopped pretending the tests were about understanding. Understanding had failed. What remained was leverage. They didn't tell Saitama that. They told him the next session would be shorter and less invasive. They told him it would help them wrap things up faster. They told him lunch would still be provided. Saitama agreed, because none of that sounded unreasonable. The third facility sat farther out than the others, isolated under the excuse of privacy and safety. The architecture was cleaner, newer, and more expensive. White corridors, seamless walls, doors that closed softly instead of slamming. Everything about the place suggested control without admitting it. From the moment Saitama arrived, observation intensified. Not overtly, subtly. More cameras, fewer technicians, longer pauses between instructions. Conversations stopped when he entered a room, then resumed with artificial smoothness once he passed. He noticed vaguely the way people avoided eye contact now. That was new. The session began with nothing physical at all. They asked questions, not about power, about habits, preferences, history. Saitama answered honestly, short responses, no elaboration. When asked how long he'd been strong, he said he wasn't sure. When asked what motivated him, he shrugged. When asked what he wanted, he said a good sale at the grocery store. The answers were logged anyway. Behind the glass, analysts tried to build psychological profiles and found nothing to anchor them. No trauma spikes, No ego tells, no exploitable pattern. He didn't respond to flattery. He didn't respond to pressure. He didn't respond to silence. He's not withholding, one psychologist said quietly. There's just nothing to grab. That assessment was ignored. The next step involved stimuli. Not pain, not force. Responsibility. They showed him footage, curated, selective, emotional, cities in distress, subs failing, systems overwhelmed. Vought framed it as context, not coercion. Look what's out there, they implied. Look how much worse it could be without intervention. Saitama watched politely. That looks bad, he said. The room leaned forward. Do you feel responsible? Someone asked carefully. No, Saitama replied. Should I? The silence that followed was heavy and uncomfortable. That was when Vought crossed the line. Not publicly, internally. They rerouted emergency alerts, so Saitama would be the first responder without being told he was. A bridge collapse in a rural area. A chemical spill near a factory town. Situations designed to escalate slowly if ignored. Saitama responded because he always did. He showed up, fixed what he could, left quietly. Vought logged everything. Time to arrival, resolution speed, collateral minimization. They weren't studying him anymore. They were studying dependence. The danger wasn't that Saitama was powerful. It was that he was reliable. Executives noticed the trend immediately. Internal projections showed a measurable drop in secondary response efficiency when Saitama intervened first, not because others were worse, but because they waited. That frightened the board. We're building reliance, one director said, unmanaged reliance. Then manage it, another replied. That word manage changed everything. The next test wasn't framed as a test. It was framed as a request. A controlled scenario where Saitama's presence would demonstrate effectiveness to select stakeholders. No cameras, no press, just observers. Saitama agreed as usual. The scenario went wrong almost immediately. Not because of him. Because Vought let it. A fire suppression system failed to activate on schedule. Evacuation routes were delayed. Risk factors nudged just enough to see how Saitama would respond under increasing pressure. He responded by fixing everything faster. Lives saved, damage minimized, crisis ended before it could become visible. From a humanitarian perspective, it was perfect. From a corporate one, it was terrifying. They had just proven something they couldn't unprove. That night, a confidential report circulated among top leadership. Subject intervention suppresses institutional authority through efficiency. Recommendation, limit autonomy. No one said the word containment, but everyone understood it. The boys learned about Phase 3 through a scientist who quit mid-shift and didn't stop driving until she crossed state lines. She was shaking when she spoke. They're not trying to control him directly, she said. They're trying to control where he shows up, what he sees, what he thinks needs fixing. Butcher's expression hardened. They're turning him into infrastructure. And if he refuses, Huey asked. The scientist swallowed. They haven't planned for that, they don't think he will. Back at the facility, Saitama finished another session and waited by the exit, hands in pockets. Am I done for today? He asked. A handler smiled too quickly. Almost just one more thing. They handed him a device. A tracker. They didn't call it that. They called it a safety beacon for emergencies, for coordination. Saitama turned it over in his hand. Do I have to wear it? The handler hesitated for half a second. It would help. Saitama shrugged and clipped it on. Okay. That single action set off 3 silent alarms. Ashley Barrett stared at the confirmation feed and felt something twist in her chest. Not relief, but dread. They hadn't earned his compliance. They mistaken indifference for permission. And now they were about to find out what happened when convenience crossed into expectation. Saitama left the facility, beacon blinking softly against his belt, unaware that his movements were now being plotted, categorized, and optimized. Behind him, Vought celebrated a breakthrough. They finally had a way to track the untrackable. They didn't stop to consider the more important question. What would happen when the variable noticed? The beacon worked perfectly. Too perfectly. From the moment Saitama clipped it to his belt, Vought's dashboards lit up with clean, elegant lines of movement. Heat maps formed around his presence. Response times tightened. Predictive models, previously useless, began producing forecasts with disturbing accuracy. Not because they understood Saitama. Because they understood people. Vought learned where he went when nothing was wrong, which neighborhoods he passed through without stopping, which signals pulled him off course. They learned that he responded to urgency, not authority, need, not orders. They learned how to frame problems so they would intersect with his path naturally. They stopped asking him to help. They started arranging the world so he would. Saitama noticed the change in a vague, unfocused way. He felt busier, not rushed, just scheduled. One problem bled into the next. A collapsed tunnel led to a grid failure, led to a floodgate malfunction that hadn't been an issue until he arrived. He fixed things anyway. That's what he did. At first, the beacon felt convenient. He didn't have to ask for directions anymore. Rescue teams showed up faster. Barriers opened automatically. People seemed relieved when he arrived, even if they didn't cheer. Then he realized something strange. He was never early. Every time he showed up, the situation was already bad enough to require him, but never bad enough that someone else couldn't have tried first. Fires burned longer before response. Structural failures were left pending assessment. Local authorities hesitated in ways they hadn't before. They were waiting. Vought noticed that too. Internal projections confirmed it. Secondary responders delayed intervention when Saitama was within range. Not consciously, subconsciously. Why risk escalation when the quiet solution was already moving? A junior analyst flagged the trend as dangerous. Her report was buried. From a corporate perspective, this was success. Saitama was becoming a stabilizing asset, unpaid, unquestioning, and impossibly effective. Vought didn't need to control him directly anymore. They just needed to manage the flow of problems. Ashley Barrett sat through a closed-door meeting where the word ownership was never spoken, but everything pointed to it. "We need consistency," one executive said. "Predictable availability." "We don't own him," Ashley replied carefully. "No," the executive said, "but we own the infrastructure around him." That distinction satisfied everyone except Ashley. The next escalation came quietly. The beacon firmware updated overnight. No new features were announced, no permissions requested. The device simply began prioritizing alerts, soft vibrations when Saitama was near something flagged as high impact. The definitions were vague, flexible. Saitama felt the first buzz while grocery shopping. He paused in the aisle, looked down at the blinking light, then sighed and put the basket back. "Sorry," he muttered to no one. He arrived at a construction site minutes later, where a crane failure had pinned workers beneath twisted steel. He lifted, stabilized, freed them, and left before anyone could say his name. The workers survived. The footage never aired. Instead, a different clip made the rounds. Security footage leaked anonymously. It showed Saitama ignoring a minor incident downtown because he was responding elsewhere. The caption didn't accuse. It questioned, why did he choose this over that? Who decided what mattered? The narrative didn't blame him. It blamed ambiguity. Vought's internal messaging shifted subtly. They spoke about coordination, about clarity, about how even good intentions needed structure. The beacon, they said, was a tool to help him help more effectively. Saitama didn't read the memos. He just felt more tired. Not physically, existentially. He started arriving at scenes where people looked at him not with relief but expectation, like he was late, like his presence was an entitlement. A firefighter snapped at him once, "Took you long enough." Saitama blinked, "Sorry." That word, sorry, echoed in Ashley Barrett's head when she reviewed the clip later. She requested a pause. A soft one, no more firmware changes, no more alert prioritization, let things breathe. The board declined. "We can't afford unpredictability," they said. What they meant was, we can't afford him choosing. The boys felt the shift from the outside. "He's not just helping," Butcher growled, watching a map of recent interventions. "He's Bane-rooted." "They're using him like a pressure valve," Huey said, "and everyone else is standing back." "That's how it starts," Butcher replied. "You build a god, then you complain when it decides." But Saitama hadn't decided anything yet. That was the problem. The breaking point came with a non-event. A chemical plant reported a minor containment issue, well within standard response capability. Under normal conditions, it would have been handled locally. This time, the alert was escalated, prioritized, nudged into Saitama's path. He arrived to find a full response team already there. They stared at him, confused. "You don't need me," Saitama said. The team leader hesitated. "We were told to wait." Saitama looked at the beacon, then at the plant. Nothing was wrong, not yet. He unclipped the device and held it in his hand. "Oh," he said quietly, "that's weird." The words barely registered before alarms spiked. Not at the plant. At the facility. Back at Vought, systems lit up in cascading failure as the beacon went dark. Tracking lost. Predictive models collapsed. Automated response queues jammed with conflicting priorities. Ashley stood slowly, heart pounding. "Find him," someone shouted. Saitama stood at the edge of the plant, beacon in his palm, feeling the faint vibration die out. He wasn't angry. He wasn't alarmed. He was annoyed. Not by the testing, by the assumption. He looked back at the plant. The team was handling it. He nodded once, turned, and walked away. Behind him, Vought scrambled to re-establish visibility. Because for the first time since the testing began, they didn't know where Saitama was going next. And worse, they didn't know if he would answer again. The absence was immediate. Within hours of the beacon going dark, response time stretched. Not catastrophically at first, just enough to be noticed by people who watched numbers for a living. Dispatch queues backed up. Redundancy protocols kicked in too late. Minor incidents stacked into moderate ones, and moderate ones threatened to tip into something worse. Nothing exploded. That was the problem. Without Saitama's quiet interventions smoothing the edges, the world didn't collapse, it hesitated. Systems designed with the assumption of an invisible fix suddenly had to make decisions again, and decision-making had never been Vaught's strength. Ashley Barrett stood in a crisis room that didn't feel like one yet. No alarms blaring, no screaming headlines, just screens full of yellow indicators drifting slowly toward orange. "Where is he?" someone asked. No one answered. Analysts ran projections without him in the equation and didn't like what they saw. Not because things became impossible, but because they became uncertain. The models had adapted to Saitama's presence the way muscles adapt to a brace, quietly, unconsciously, and completely. Remove the brace, and nothing breaks immediately. It just starts to hurt. Vaught's first instinct was denial. Publicly, they insisted nothing had changed. Privately, they issued a silent directive: do not acknowledge the gap. No press briefings. No internal emails that used the word missing. Instead, they leaned on substitutes. Subs were redeployed into zones Saitama used to cover, not because they were qualified, but because the absence needed a face. The results were predictable. Property damage increased. Civilian injuries followed. Cleanup costs tripled. But the footage looked good. Vought pushed it anyway. Saitama noticed the consequences in pieces. A bridge collapse he arrived at too late. A neighborhood flooded longer than it should have been. He didn't connect them at first. He just felt the difference in the air, thicker, more anxious, like the city was holding its breath without knowing why. He helped when he crossed paths with trouble, lifted where needed, stabilized when it made sense. He didn't rush. He didn't prioritize. And without realizing it, that neutrality became the most disruptive variable of all. Vought tried indirect contact next. No summons, no demands, just suggestions threaded through public channels. Emergency bulletins timed to his known routes. Social media alerts amplified near his location. Subtle, polite nudges asking for help without asking him directly. He ignored most of them. Not out of spite, out of simplicity. He didn't have the beacon anymore. No vibration telling him where he was most needed, just noise. At headquarters, frustration curdled into something sharper. "This isn't sustainable," an executive snapped. "We built around him." Ashley didn't look up. "We assumed around him." "That's the same thing." "No," she said quietly, "it's worse." A senior systems architect finally said what no one wanted to admit. "We've optimized ourselves for a variable we don't control." Silence followed. Dependence wasn't part of the plan. Saitama was supposed to be a force multiplier, not a keystone. But keystones aren't chosen. They're discovered, usually right before everything else starts leaning on them. The boys saw it from a different angle. "He's not disappearing," Butcher muttered, watching a live feed of a delayed evacuation. "They're just realizing they can't plan without him." "So what happens now?" Huey asked. Butcher smirked without humor. "Now they panic without looking like they are." That panic took shape in a proposal labeled Interim Stability Initiative. On paper, it was harmless. Community resilience funding, expanded first responder authority, enhanced coordination between Vought and municipal agencies. Buried deep in the annex was the real objective: reestablish predictable conditions that would naturally pull Saitama back into a central role. They didn't need the beacon. They needed the vacuum. So Vought slowed things down. Not catastrophically, not visibly, just enough to let pressure build where he was likely to notice. Areas he frequented experienced delays. Repairs waited a little longer. Permits stalled. Resource constraints were cited. Saitama walked past a closed shelter one night and frowned. The lights were on inside. People waited outside in the cold. "Why's it closed?" he asked the guard. "Waiting on clearance," the guard said. "Should have been done hours ago." Saitama sighed, walked to the door and pulled it open. The lock snapped like it had been made of chalk. Inside, the mood shifted instantly. Relief spread. Gratitude followed. Someone recognized him and whispered his name. By morning, the story circulated, not as a headline but as a reassurance. He's still here. Vought logged the incident as a success. Ashley read the report and felt sick. They escalated carefully after that. Never too much, never everywhere, just enough friction to create gratitude when it vanished, just enough inconvenience to make his presence feel necessary again. Saitama helped more often, not because he was guided, because the world around him felt heavier. The burden returned without permission. Then something went wrong. A refinery incident spiraled faster than expected. Not a disaster, yet but trending that way. Saitama arrived and did what he always did: stabilized the structure, sealed the breach, reduced risk to near zero. He turned to leave. "Wait," a supervisor said. "Can you stay just in case?" Saitama paused. "For how long?" The man hesitated. "Until it's safe." Saitama looked around. Everything was safe, had been for minutes. "I think it's okay," he said. He left anyway. The incident re-escalated an hour later. Not because of physics. Because of procedure. Someone waited. Someone assumed he'd come back. Someone delayed a step that only worked if he was there to finish it. This time, people were hurt. Not many, not badly, but enough. The footage didn't show Saitama failing. It showed him leaving. Vought didn't release it. Someone else did. The narrative shifted overnight. Not accusatory, not hostile. Questioning. Should someone with that much ability ever walk away? Saitama watched the clip on a public screen and tilted his head. "Huh," he said. He turned it off and went home. At Vought, the room went quiet as the implications sank in. They hadn't just depended on him. They taught the world too. And now, whether he wanted it or not, every choice he made, or didn't, was changing outcomes. Ashley closed her eyes. "This is going to force a response," she said. "From who?" an executive asked. She didn't answer. Because for the first time since the testing began, the question wasn't how to get Saitama back into the system. It was how the system would survive if he decided not to be part of it at all. And somewhere across the city, Saitama sat on his couch, staring at the ceiling, feeling something unfamiliar settle in. Not anger. Not guilt. Responsibility. The world didn't punish Saitama immediately. It adjusted. That adjustment was subtle at first, the kind of shift that only showed up in internal audits and emergency briefings marked non-public. Vought's response matrices grew denser. Contingency plans expanded. Human decision-making crept back into spaces that had quietly been ceded to an unspoken assumption. Someone else will fix it. Now someone else wasn't guaranteed. Ashley Barrett sat through a briefing where no one raised their voice. That worried her more than shouting ever had. Calm meant resignation, and resignation meant acceptance of loss. The charts on the screen showed increased response times, higher insurance exposure, and a measurable rise in civilian skepticism towards superhero intervention. He didn't fail, an analyst said carefully. He disengaged. Ashley tapped the table. The public doesn't care about that distinction. Outside the boardroom, Vought's PR division was already at work, threading the needle. They didn't accuse Saitama. They didn't praise him either. They reframed the narrative around personal boundaries and independent actors. Carefully neutral language designed to imply that reliance on any one individual, no matter how capable, was unrealistic. It was damage control disguised as philosophy. The boys watched it unfold with growing unease. "They're not going after him," Huey said. "They're going around him." Butcher nodded. "That's worse." Because going around meant restructuring. It meant making choices that didn't include Saitama at all. Vought accelerated the rollout of fallback assets, not because they worked better, but because they could be scheduled, branded, and blamed. Subs filled the vacuum unevenly. Some tried too hard. Others pulled back, suddenly aware that the invisible safety net was gone. Collateral damage spiked in places where it never had before, and the explanations came fast and hollow. Meanwhile, Saitama went about his life. He missed a few emergencies he would have caught before, not because he was avoiding them, but because there was no longer a mechanism funneling him toward them. He helped when he happened to be nearby. He didn't chase alerts. He didn't monitor feeds. The world interpreted that silence loudly. Talk shows debated responsibility. Commentators argued about obligation versus choice. Someone coined a term, passive power, to describe individuals whose mere existence reshaped outcomes even when they did nothing. Saitama heard the term once, nodded and forgot it. The real cost surfaced days later. A large-scale evacuation stalled when a structural collapse blocked the primary route. In the past, the protocol assumed a high-confidence intervention window, an undefined margin where external assistance could resolve obstacles. That margin had been invisible. Now it was. Emergency crews waited too long. Secondary routes clogged. Panic spread. By the time the obstruction was cleared conventionally, the situation had worsened beyond what it should have been. No one died. That was the headline. The subheadline, avoidable harm, circulated quietly among professionals. Someone leaked internal emails showing that the original evacuation timeline had been built with Saitama's intervention implicitly assumed. No directive had ever stated it outright. No document named him. But the math did. Public trust dipped another notch. Saitama saw the aftermath in person, walking through a temporary shelter the next morning. People were tired. Some were angry. Most were confused. A woman recognized him and froze, halfway between relief and resentment. "You were supposed to come," she said, not accusing, just stating. Saitama frowned slightly. "I didn't know." She nodded. "Yeah, they said that." He helped where he could, moving supplies, reinforcing supports, but the atmosphere didn't lighten the way it used to. Gratitude was mixed with something heavier. Expectation. He left early. That night, Ashley authorized a program she had resisted for weeks. Predictive presence modeling. The goal wasn't to control Saitama directly. It was to model the probability of his involvement based on location, time, and historical behavior. If they couldn't command him, they could anticipate him. And if they could anticipate him, they could quietly plan around him again. The ethical objections were logged and overridden. Within days, Vought could predict with uncomfortable accuracy where Saitama was likely to be and where he was. Resources shifted accordingly. Areas outside his projected radius were deprioritized, subtly at first, then more boldly. Saitama noticed something was off when he arrived at an incident site already overrun with personnel. "Why so many?" he asked. A coordinator hesitated. "We weren't sure if you'd show." Saitama blinked. "Okay." He turned around and left. The incident was handled, poorly but adequately. The lesson Vought took from it was the wrong one. We don't need him every time. They pushed the model harder. The boys intercepted fragments of the program through a contact who quit rather than sign another NDA. "They're gambling," Huey said, "betting lives on whether he feels like showing up." "But he's not," Butcher replied. "That's the point. They're trying to force relevance by absence." Saitama felt the weight of that absence without fully understanding it. He wasn't indifferent to consequences. He just didn't believe he was the linchpin everyone seemed to think he was. That belief shattered during a late-night incident at a power substation. He arrived as the situation escalated, stabilized the structure instinctively, and stepped back, only to realize the crew had already evacuated. "Where'd everyone go?" he asked. A technician stared at him. "We were told not to wait." "For what?" "For you," the technician said, then stopped. "I mean." Saitama looked at the humming infrastructure, now secure, and then at the empty perimeter. They hadn't waited because they couldn't assume him anymore. And because they couldn't assume him, they'd stopped building plans that included him at all. That realization landed quietly. Not as guilt, as displacement. He wasn't being depended on anymore. He was being worked around. Back at Vought, Ashley read the latest projections and felt the creeping dread settle in. The models were stabilizing. The system was learning to function without Saitama, not because it was safer, but because it had to. That adaptability came at a cost, no one wanted to say out loud. The world was becoming harsher, less forgiving, more brittle. And Saitama, for the first time, understood that walking away hadn't removed responsibility. It had redistributed it, in a way that hurt more people than his presence ever had. He sat on his couch that night, TV off, room quiet, and stared at his hands. Not because he doubted his power, but because he finally saw the scale of what not using it did. Somewhere deep inside Vought, a new directive was drafted. Not to bring Saitama back, but to make sure the world stopped expecting him to. And that choice, made without his input, was going to force a confrontation no one was ready for. The moment the world stopped waiting, it didn't announce itself. There were no press conferences, no internal memos stamped paradigm shift, no single event dramatic enough to mark the transition. Instead, the change revealed itself through patterns, quiet decisions made faster than before, risks accepted where patience once lived. Vought didn't declare independence from Saitama. It engineered irrelevance around him. Emergency response frameworks were rewritten with a new core assumption: no uncontrollable assets. The language was technical, sanitized, and deliberately vague. What it meant in practice was simple. If a solution depended on Saitama, it wasn't a solution anymore. Ashley Barrett signed off on the final revision at 2:13 a.m., starring at the clause that removed all non-contractual anomalous interventions from high-priority planning. Her hand hovered over the tablet for longer than necessary. Then she signed. The ripple effect was immediate. Subs were redeployed not based on effectiveness, but on reliability. A weaker asset that followed orders was preferable to an unstoppable one that didn't answer calls. Response times normalized again, not because outcomes improved, but because expectations lowered. Disasters were managed, not prevented. The public noticed, not in outrage, but in resignation. People stopped asking why certain things weren't fixed faster. They stopped wondering whether someone would show up and make it all disappear. The myth of effortless rescue eroded, replaced by something colder and more realistic. Fear adapted. Saitama saw the difference on the streets. Less crowding, fewer people looking up when things went wrong. More barricades, more warning tape, more procedures that treated danger as inevitable rather than temporary. He helped when he could, but the help landed differently now. Instead of relief, it sparked confusion, sometimes annoyance. "Didn't know you were assigned here," a responder told him once. "I'm not," Saitama replied. The responder nodded and went back to work. That was new. The boys watched the shift with a mix of grim satisfaction and unease. "This is what happens when gods don't pick sides," Huey said quietly. Butcher scowled. "No, this is what happens when people stop believing gods are common." Vought's next move was subtle and devastating. They launched a public-facing initiative focused on resilience without reliance, training programs, infrastructure hardening, messaging that framed vulnerability as strength and adaptation as progress. Saitama's name never came up. That omission spoke louder than any criticism. He was no longer a factor. Homelander felt it before anyone else did. Not because of data, but because attention shifted. Where once comparisons inevitably led to him and Saitama, now neither occupied the spotlight. Vought's narrative moved past individuals entirely, selling systems instead of symbols. Homelander tried to reassert himself, louder appearances, more aggressive posturing, but the audience response was muted. Fear without awe felt empty. Saitama passed by a live broadcast once and didn't stop. No one asked him to. The incident that cemented the change came during a city-wide blackout triggered by cascading grid failures. In the past, the expectation would have been intervention, someone strong enough to brute force stabilization. This time, crews followed protocol. They shut sections down, evacuated selectively, accepted losses. Saitama arrived midway through, surveyed the damage and stepped forward. A coordinator stopped him. "We've got it," she said, firm but not rude. "Stand down." Saitama blinked. "I can fix it." She shook her head. "That's not the plan." The grid took longer to recover. Hospitals switched to backup power. Some equipment failed. Lives were impacted, not lost but diminished. The news framed it as managed adversity. Saitama walked away before the lights came back on. For the first time since he'd arrived in this world, he felt truly unnecessary. Not unwanted. Unnecessary. That distinction cut deeper than hostility ever could. At Vought, internal metrics showed a strange stabilization. Casualties per incident rose slightly. Cost per response increased, but predictability improved. Investors liked predictability. Ashley stared at the numbers and felt something close to grief. They had made the world safer on paper, harder in reality. And they had done it by removing the one variable that refused to fit. The boys confronted her indirectly, leaking just enough data to expose the trade-offs. It sparked debate, not outrage. The public had already adjusted. "You didn't just move past him," Huey said later, watching reactions scroll by. "You taught everyone to." Butcher lit a cigarette with shaking hands. "Yeah, and now he's gotta decide if he lets that stick." Saitama sat on a rooftop overlooking the city that night, watching lights blink back on in uneven clusters. He didn't feel angry. He felt sidelined. The world had adapted to his absence faster than he expected, not because it was better without him, but because it couldn't afford to wait. And that raised a question he hadn't considered before. If his presence warped systems this much, what would his decision do? Not a punch, not an intervention, a choice. Behind the scenes, Vought prepared for the next phase. If Saitama was no longer central, he was also no longer protected by dependency. Legal teams drafted language redefining unauthorized interference. Security divisions discussed contingency frameworks, not to stop him, but to manage the fallout if he acted against established plans. They weren't afraid of him. They were afraid of unpredictability. And unpredictability, once identified, tends to provoke preemptive action. Saitama looked out over the city and sighed. "Guess I waited too long," he said quietly. Somewhere below, decisions were already in motion that would force his hand, not through force, but through consequence. Because a world that stops waiting doesn't stop moving. And it doesn't always look back. Saitama didn't announce his decision. There was no speech, no declaration of intent, no symbolic gesture meant to draw attention. He simply chose a direction and walked into it, unaware that the act of choosing, after so long of drifting, would ripple harder than any intervention he'd ever made. The disruption began with something small. A controlled demolition was scheduled in a neglected industrial district, part of Vought's resilience initiative. The plan accepted collateral damage as unavoidable. Evacuation zones were set. Timelines were approved. Insurance models cleared the losses. Saitama arrived early. He looked at the building, then at the surrounding blocks. Old apartments, temporary shelters, people who hadn't been moved because the models said they didn't have to be. He didn't argue. He didn't call anyone. He lifted the structure, stabilized the fault lines, and set it back down intact. The demolition was canceled on the spot, not by command but by impossibility. Crews stared. Supervisors hesitated. Someone said that wasn't authorized. Saitama nodded, okay. Then he left. The incident didn't fit anywhere. It wasn't sabotage. It wasn't heroics. It wasn't part of any plan. It forced Vought to react without a script. Ashley Barrett read the report twice and closed her eyes. "He picked," she said. "Not a side. A moment." That distinction terrified the board. Because when Saitama intervened now, it wasn't as a stabilizer. It was as an exception, an unpredictable override that made every carefully constructed plan provisional. They issued a quiet advisory to field teams. Do not rely on anomalous assistance. Do not obstruct it either. Translation: let him pass, but don't build around him. The next disruption was bigger. A coordinated soup response botched a containment operation in a crowded transit hub. The plan had been optimized for compliance and optics, not outcome. When it failed, escalation protocols kicked in, slowly. Saitama arrived mid-chaos. He didn't ask who was in charge. He removed the threat in seconds, stabilized the structure, and redirected civilians with simple gestures. No spectacle, no collateral. When he finished, the subs were still standing there, hands half raised, plans irrelevant. One of them spoke. "We had it under control." Saitama looked at the injured civilians being carried out. "Did you?" The question wasn't accusatory. It was factual. The footage leaked before Vought could bury it. Not as a triumph, as a contrast. Public reaction was immediate and uncomfortable, not because Saitama saved the day, but because he made visible how much worse things had become without him. Vought's messaging scrambled to keep up. They praised coordination, emphasized teamwork, framed Saitama's actions as supplemental. No one believed it. The boys watched the shift with a grim sense of inevitability. "He's not fighting the system," Butcher said. "He's exposing it." "And that's worse," Huey replied, "because now everyone sees the gap." Dependents tried to creep back in, not structurally but psychologically. People began hesitating again, eyes searching crowds, scanning skis, not waiting for permission. Waiting for him. Saitama noticed it immediately. He started leaving faster. Not out of rejection, out of prevention. He chose where to intervene carefully now, not based on severity alone, but on what his presence would teach. If stepping in would reinforce waiting, he didn't. If acting would reduce harm without becoming a crutch, he did. The world struggled to keep up with that logic. Vought struggled more. Internally, the contradiction was tearing them apart. Their systems required predictability. Saitama's choices created localized perfection and systemic chaos. Every time he acted, he invalidated the models. Every time he didn't, the harm felt louder by comparison. An executive finally said what others were thinking. "He's making us look incompetent." Ashley didn't respond. Because incompetence wasn't the problem. Control was. They escalated the only way they could. Not with force, with rules. New emergency ordinances rolled out under the guise of coordination. Restricted zones, authorization requirements, liability frameworks that quietly criminalized unsanctioned intervention, not nomming Saitama, but clearly aimed at him. When Saitama stepped into a restricted zone during a flood response, a commander blocked his path. "Sir, you can't be here." Saitama tilted his head. "People are stuck. We're handling it." He looked past the barricade, water rising, evacuation delayed. He stepped around the commander. The barricade crumpled. He saved the trapped civilians. By the time he finished, warrants were already being drafted. Not to arrest him, to define him. Vought needed to draw a line, not because they could enforce it, but because systems collapse without boundaries. The legal framework wasn't meant to stop Saitama. It was meant to stop others from expecting him. Ashley stared at the document authorizing the classification of Saitama as an unregulated external actor. It won't hold, she said. It doesn't need to, the board replied. It needs to exist. The news broke carefully. Not hostile. Concerned. Debates flared about accountability, about unchecked power, about the danger of unilateral action, even benevolent. Saitama watched a panel discussion from a diner and finished his meal. "Huh," he said. He paid and left. The next incident forced clarity. A multi-point infrastructure failure threatened to cascade into city-wide disaster. Vought's plan accepted partial collapse to preserve core systems. It was efficient. It was brutal. Saitama arrived before execution. He surveyed the network, then made a choice. He fixed everything. Not instantly. Methodically. He stayed. Hours passed. Crews watched, stunned, as systems stabilized beyond projected limits. The disaster dissolved, not into manageable loss, but into absence. When it was over, the silence was deafening. The city breathed, and every model Vought had built shattered at once. Because Saitama hadn't just intervened. He'd disproven the necessity of compromise. Ashley knew then. This wasn't about walking away anymore, or waiting, or being irrelevant. This was about choice becoming disruption, because once someone shows the world what could be done, returning to less becomes unbearable. Vought couldn't contain that. They couldn't monetize it. They couldn't erase it. All they could do now was decide how hard they were willing to push back. Because Saitama had crossed an invisible line. Not by defying authority, by rendering it optional. And the world was about to demand an answer to a question no system was built to handle. What happens when perfection appears and refuses to belong to anyone? Authority never reacts well to being made optional. At first, the pushback looked procedural. No sirens, no squads in the street, just documents, directives, and quietly updated protocols that spread through agencies like a virus no one acknowledged. Saitama's name wasn't mentioned, but his absence was implied in every clause that emphasized chain of command and authorized response. Vought framed it as maturity. We're moving past dependency, spokespeople said, toward resilience. Behind closed doors, it was something else entirely. Fear, not of Saitama's strength, that had been clear from the beginning, but of what he represented now. He wasn't just an uncontrollable variable anymore. He was proof that the compromises authority relied on were choices, not necessities. That kind of proof doesn't destabilize buildings. It destabilizes legitimacy. Ashley Barrett sat across from a joint task force of legal, military, and corporate advisors who had never agreed on anything before. Now they spoke with unsettling unity. "We need boundaries," one general said, "even symbolic ones." "He won't respect them," Ashley replied. "We don't need him to," the general said. "We need everyone else to." The plan that emerged was clean and indirect. No confrontation. No detention. No attempt to stop Saitama physically. Instead, they would reclaim narrative and space. Restricted zones expanded. Civilian evacuations became mandatory where anomalies were detected. Response times were intentionally accelerated to deny Saitama the chance to arrive first. When he did show up, he found scenes already cordoned, already controlled, already framed as handled. Sometimes they were. Sometimes people suffered because of it. Saitama noticed. He arrived at a building collapse to find responders turning him away. "Please step back," an officer said, hands shaking but voice firm. "We've got it." The building groaned behind them, supports failing, people trapped. Saitama looked at the officer. "You don't." The officer swallowed. "Orders." Saitama stepped forward anyway. The line broke. He stabilized the structure, pulled survivors free and left before anyone could stop him. The aftermath was messy: arguments, reports, accusations of interference. The headlines didn't praise him. They questioned him. Who decides when intervention crosses into disruption? The question wasn't aimed at Saitama. It was aimed at the audience. Vought amplified it carefully. Panels debated accountability. Experts warned about the dangers of unilateral power, not because Saitama had caused harm, but because he had bypassed process. But process was all authority had left. The boys watched the rhetoric sharpen. "They're setting him up," Butcher said, "not as a threat but as a problem." "Can that even work?" Huey asked. Butcher exhaled. "Doesn't have to, it just has to make people hesitate." And it did. Civilians began pulling back when Saitama arrived. Not afraid, uncertain. Responders hesitated to coordinate with him. Some asked him to leave, not because they could enforce it, but because they were afraid of consequences after. Saitama complied more often than not. Not because he agreed, because forcing his way through every time would teach the wrong lesson. He started choosing moments more sharply. Smaller interventions, quieter fixes, acts that couldn't be framed as defiance or dominance. Authority responded by escalating symbolism. A formal classification was announced. Unregistered anomalous actor. No penalties attached. No enforcement mechanism. Just a label. Ashley read the announcement and felt the weight of it settle into place. Labels didn't need teeth to bite. They only needed to change how people thought. Saitama heard the term on a radio and shrugged. "Sounds complicated," he said. The complication arrived soon after. A major infrastructure failure, worse than anything before, hit during peak hours. Vaught's plan was ruthless but contained. Accept loss here to prevent catastrophe there. 1,000 injuries instead of tens of thousands. Saitama arrived early. He could fix it. He knew he could. But so did everyone else. A command vehicle rolled up, lights flashing. A senior official stepped out and approached him carefully. "Sir," she said, "if you intervene now, you will be acting against an active federal response." Saitama looked at the city, the lines of failure, the people who would be hurt, not killed but broken. "And if I do?" he asked. She didn't hesitate. "We proceed." He nodded. "I'm going to fix it," he said. The official swallowed. "Then we'll have to respond." Saitama paused. Not because of the threat. Because for the first time, his choice wouldn't just expose the system. It would openly break it. He stepped forward. Alarms blared, not for the disaster but for him. Drones lifted, cameras locked on. Orders were shouted into headsets not to stop him but to document him. Saitama moved anyway. He stabilized the network, redirected flows, prevented the cascade entirely. It took minutes. When it was over, the city stood intact. And authority stood humiliated. The response was immediate. Not violence. Retaliation. Legal action. Emergency injunctions. Public condemnation framed as concern. The phrase reckless benevolence trended worldwide. Saitama left the site without a word. Ashley watched the fallout unfold and felt something close to despair. They had pushed. He hadn't flinched. Now there was no way to pretend coexistence was stable. Either Saitama accepted constraint, or authority would escalate in ways that no longer pretended to be rational. Not because they could stop him, because they couldn't afford not to try. Somewhere in the city, Saitama stood on a rooftop, looking down at streets that were safe because he'd chosen them to be. And for the first time since he arrived in this world, he understood the real confrontation ahead. Not fists, not force, but a system that would rather burn credibility, trust, and people. Then admit it no longer had the final say. The escalation after the injunction didn't come from the streets. It came from silence. Saitama woke up to a world that had decided not to speak to him anymore. Emergency feeds stopped lighting up when he was nearby. Public alerts were rerouted. Coordination channels he'd never known he was indirectly using went dark the moment his presence was detected. No one told him to stay away. They simply removed him from the equation. The legal language was careful, almost respectful. Authorities emphasized cooperation, safety, and unified command. They insisted nothing had changed, only clarified. Saitama was welcome to exist, welcome to observe, welcome to assist if requested. Requests never came. Ashley Barrett understood the strategy immediately. "They're starving him," she said quietly, "not of access, of relevance." If Saitama acted now, it would be without context, without coordination, without anyone asking. Any intervention could be framed as unilateral, disruptive, or even dangerous, not because of what he did, but because of how it bypassed process. Authority had learned the only leverage it had left. Joyce. The boys felt the shift too. "This is bad," Huey said. "They're daring him to cross the line." Butcher shook his head. "No, they're hopping, he won't." Because if Saitama didn't act, the system would hold. Ugly, inefficient, compromised, but intact. If he did, the confrontation would stop being philosophical. It would become existential. Saitama noticed the absence slowly. He walked through neighborhoods where alarms once sounded at the first sign of trouble. Now, incidents unfolded quietly, contained behind barriers and procedure. People didn't look to the sky anymore. They looked at uniforms. And when things went wrong, they endured. That endurance hurt more to watch than panic ever had. He arrived at a collapsed transit tunnel hours after the incident. Rescue teams were already packing up. The damage had been mitigated but not prevented. Lives disrupted. Injuries logged. "You could have stopped this," a worker muttered, not angrily, tired. Saitama frowned. "I didn't know." The worker shrugged. "They didn't tell you." That was the moment Saitama understood the trap. If he acted only when informed, he'd never act again. If he acted without being informed, he'd be defying a system that had made its stance clear. Either way, the world would change. Vought's internal discussions grew sharper. Some executives argued for de-escalation, for reopening channels, for pragmatic compromise. Others saw opportunity. "If he stays quiet," one said, "we prove systems matter more than saviors." "And if he does?" Ashley asked. "Then we redefine him," the executive replied, publicly. The redefinition began that night. A coordinated media cycle rolled out stories questioning unchecked intervention, not accusing Saitama of harm, suggesting risk. Experts spoke about precedent, about how even benevolence needed consent, how power without accountability eroded democracy. Saitama watched one segment from a rooftop cafe and sipped his drink. "Huh," he said again. The real test arrived with a catastrophe no plan could fully contain. A cascading failure across transportation, power, and communications hit the city during a storm. Vought's response minimized loss by isolating districts, sacrificing some to save the whole. It was efficient. It was brutal. Saitama arrived early enough to stop it entirely. No barriers stopped him. No one asked him to. From the edge of the city, he could see the choice laid bare. Act and erase the consequences, but shatter the authority that had deliberately excluded him, or walk away and let the system prove its resilience at a human cost. This wasn't about being needed. It was about deciding who was allowed to decide. Saitama stood still longer than he ever had before an intervention. Not because he doubted the outcome, because he understood the weight. If he fixed this, there would be no going back. Authority wouldn't adapt quietly anymore. It would escalate openly. Labels would harden. Lines would be drawn. If he didn't, people would suffer. Not because he couldn't help, but because he chose not to. He exhaled and stepped forward. The storm didn't slow him. The failures unraveled as he moved through them, redirected, reinforced, undone. He worked without spectacle, without pause, without regard for cameras that tracked his every move. By dawn, the city stood intact, and authority stood exposed. The response was immediate and final. A joint declaration labeled Saitama's actions as unauthorized mass interference. Emergency powers were invoked. Restricted zones expanded nationwide. Allies distanced themselves. Institutions unified, not against destruction, but against him. Ashley read the declaration and felt the last illusion die. They weren't trying to manage Saitama anymore. They were choosing to confront the idea that someone like him could exist outside their control. Saitama stood at the city's edge as the sun rose, watching life resume because he decided it would. He didn't feel triumphant. He felt resolved, because now the choice had been made, for him and against him. And whatever came next wouldn't be about waiting, relevance, or restraint. It would be about whether the world could coexist with power that refused permission. The pushback didn't come as force. It came as consensus. Within 48 hours of Saitama's last intervention, a strange unity settled across institutions that normally spent more time undermining each other than cooperating. Governments issued synchronized statements. Corporate spokespeople echoed the same phrases. Emergency agencies updated protocols with identical language, as if the world had quietly agreed on a single premise. Power could exist, but only with permission. Saitama's actions were no longer framed as help. They were framed as override, not malicious, not destructive, but destabilizing. Analysts spoke about systemic integrity. Commentators warned that outcomes didn't matter if processes were eroded. The idea spread quickly because it was comforting. If the system was right, then suffering had meaning. If Saitama was wrong, then control still mattered. Ashley Barrett watched the alignment take shape with a mix of awe and dread. This was Vought pulling strings anymore. This was the world closing ranks around an idea that protected it from irrelevance. He broke the illusion, she said quietly, so now they're defending it. The first tangible pushback came through enforcement, not against Saitama directly, but against everyone around him. Aid groups that coordinated with him lost funding. First responders who welcomed his help were reassigned. Data access was restricted in zones he frequented. Isolation by association. Saitama noticed when people stopped making eye contact. Not fearful, careful. He walked into a response zone one afternoon and found it empty. The disaster had already been managed, poorly, inefficiently, but within acceptable parameters. When he asked where everyone had gone, a lone supervisor answered without looking up. "Orders came down," she said. "We're not supposed to involve you." Saitama nodded, "Okay." He left. That night the footage ran everywhere. Not of failure, of absence. A slow montage of incidents handled without him. Buildings saved at greater cost. Lives preserved with more damage. The message was clear. We don't need perfection. We need control. The boys argued about it in a dark apartment lit by flickering screens. "They're gaslighting the world," Butcher snarled. "Convincing worse is better long as it's official." Huey shook his head. "It's not just gaslighting, it's fear. People would rather suffer predictably than be saved by something they don't understand." That fear metastasized quickly. A protest formed outside a government complex, not demanding Saitama's help, but demanding regulation. Signs read power needs limits and no one above consent. They weren't angry at him. They were afraid of what his existence implied. Saitama watched from a distance. He didn't interrupt. He didn't counter-message. He didn't correct misconceptions. Because none of it was about him anymore. It was about whether the world could tolerate something that solved problems without asking. Authority escalated again. A global framework was proposed, the Extraordinary Oversight Accord. It outlined guidelines for dealing with anomalies of unprecedented capability. It didn't name Saitama. It didn't have to. The accord didn't include enforcement mechanisms either. It included incentives, cooperation grants, access privileges, legal protections for compliance, and penalties for refusal. Saitama wasn't targeted. Everyone else was. Ashley read the draft and felt the finality settle in. They're not trying to stop him, she said. They're trying to make sure no one stands with him. The world pushed back by withdrawing trust. Saitama intervened less, not because he agreed, but because every action now carried secondary harm. Helping someone meant costing them institutional support. Fixing a problem meant destabilizing response chains built to exclude him. The paradox was complete. The better he made things, the harder the world resisted. Then came the incident that stripped away all pretense. A multi-region disaster triggered by overlapping failures exceeded every contingency model. This wasn't a localized crisis. It was the kind of cascading emergency that exposed the fragility everyone pretended they could manage. Vought's plan fractured under the scale. Governments stalled. Jurisdictional conflicts delayed action. Saitama arrived anyway. Not because he was called, because he saw the damage spreading. He moved decisively, sealing failures, stabilizing infrastructure, preventing the collapse entirely. It took time, effort, focus. When it was over, the world stood intact again. And the backlash was immediate. Not relief. Outrage. Statements condemned the intervention as reckless, unilateral, destabilizing. Allies distanced themselves. The accord was fast-tracked and ratified within hours. Saitama's actions were officially classified as global interference. Ashley watched the vote finalize and felt hollow. "They're choosing the system," she said. Even knowing it didn't work as well. Even knowing people suffered more. Because the system gave them something Saitama never did. Permission to be in charge. Saitama stood on a hill overlooking the quieted disaster zones, watching recovery crews move through spaces that would have been ruins without him. He didn't feel angry. He felt tired. Not physically, existentially. He had done everything right by his own standards, helped when he could, held back when needed, chosen carefully. And the world had responded with rejection, not of him, but of the idea that problems could be solved without negotiation. That rejection crystallized into a single realization. As long as he stayed, the conflict would continue. Not because he was dangerous, because he made authority optional. And a world built on authority could not coexist with that. He looked up at the sky, expression neutral, and spoke softly. "So that's it, huh?" The world didn't answer, but its silence was louder than any demand. Because the pushback wasn't going to stop. It was going to harden. And the next phase wouldn't be about systems versus power. It would be about whether Saitama stayed to fight a world that refused him, or left it to prove a point no one wanted to learn. The world expected a reaction. After the accord, after the condemnations, after the coordinated withdrawal of trust, analysts predicted escalation, protest, defiance. Some imagined Saitama would make a final statement, one last intervention so overwhelming it would shatter resistance by force of example. He did none of that. Instead, the most unsettling thing happened. Nothing. No sightings, no quiet rescues, no inexplicable stabilizations in places that should have failed. Disasters unfolded exactly as the models predicted, contained, costly, and incomplete. Systems held, but only just. At first, the absence was celebrated. Stability restored, headlines read. Unified response framework proves effective. Authority congratulated itself for surviving the anomaly without conceding control. The world told itself it had passed a test. Ashley Barrett didn't believe it. She watched the metrics with a sinking feeling. Casualties rose slowly. Infrastructure decay accelerated. Budgets swelled to cover losses that never used to happen. The system worked, but it bled. Quietly, the boys felt it too. "He's gone," Huey said one night, staring at a map full of amber warnings. Not hiding, just gone. Butcher didn't reply. He already knew. Saitama left without ceremony. No portals, no spectacle. He didn't destroy anything on the way out, didn't make a point, didn't punish the world for rejecting him. He simply walked to the edge of relevance and stepped beyond it. Where he went didn't matter. What mattered was that he chose to leave the world exactly as it wanted to be. In control. The consequences arrived weeks later, once the comfort of self-congratulation wore off. A disaster struck that the models said was manageable. It was. Response chains tangled. Jurisdictional conflicts delayed action. SUPs followed protocol instead of instinct. By the time the situation stabilized, the losses were undeniable. No single failure. Just accumulation. The question began circulating quietly, without accusation. Would this have happened before? No one answered it out loud. They didn't need to. Because the absence had become measurable. Not as a spike. As a baseline shift. The world hadn't collapsed without Saitama. It had diminished. Authority remained intact. Processes were followed. Consent was respected. And people suffered more, not catastrophically, but consistently. Enough to notice. Not enough to revolt. That was the cruel balance the world chose. Ashley resigned months later, citing strategic exhaustion. Her final memo wasn't published. It didn't condemn anyone. It simply stated a fact no one wanted to formalize. We optimized for control and accepted loss as the price. Public discourse never turned Saitama into a villain. It turned him into a hypothetical. Debates framed him as a dangerous what-if, an unacceptable variable, a lesson about unchecked capability. Over time, his name faded from urgency into abstraction. A footnote in policy, a cautionary tale. And yet, in moments of crisis, when systems strained and plans frayed, someone would inevitably say it. Not loudly, not officially, just once under their breath. If he were still here. The sentence never finished. Because finishing it meant acknowledging what had been lost. The world went on. It rebuilt slower, hardened itself, learned to endure pain it used to avoid. Authority survived, scarred but standing. And somewhere beyond consequence, beyond permission, beyond relevance, Saitama existed without being needed. He didn't feel victorious. He didn't feel bitter. He felt done. Because in the end, the choice wasn't between saving the world or abandoning it. It was between belonging to a system that demanded limits, or leaving it to face the cost of insisting on them. The world chose control. Saitama chose absence. And the quiet that followed was permanent.